In just over 2 weeks, Jerome Powell will hang up the money printer for the last time as his tenure as the chairman of the Federal Reserve comes to an end. In his place, the financier and former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh has been nominated by the president to take over this role. But that job application has been going about as well as most job applications in 2026. And that is to say, not well. His confirmation for the role is currently being held up in the Senate over questions around the source of his wealth, potential conflicts of interest amongst his friends in finance, and unanswered questions about his professional relationship with the alleged financier Jeffrey Epstein. On top of that, there is a much bigger problem that most coverage is either ignoring or simply misunderstanding. And that is that the outgoing Jerome Powell could just go full Wolf of Wall Street and refuse to leave. His appointment as chairman ends in 14 days from now, but he still has a seat on the Board of Governors until 2028. So if he just sits his butt down and nobody else on the board makes room, even a unanimous Senate confirmation for Warsh won't mean diddly, because you can't be the chairman of a board you're not on. Now, normally, this is not a problem. Historically, Fed chairmen have fully stepped down from the bank to free up a seat for their incoming replacement, even if they do still technically have a few years left as a governor. Except that, until about 2 days ago, Jerome Powell, the current sitting chairman of the Fed, was the target of an ongoing criminal investigation by the DOJ, so he doesn't really want to give up this institutional protection until that gets fully resolved. It should hopefully go without saying that this is far from the standard operating procedure for this institution. And that's before getting into the problems that they will actually be facing once the musical chairs have been sorted out. There is immense political pressure to cut rates, unclear data about how bad inflation actually is, unknown pricing shocks coming from the war in Iran, tariffs, and an uncertain job market. The disconnect between investor sentiment and consumer sentiment has never been wider, and this is to say nothing of the ticking clock. The next interest rate decision is due in 45 days from now, and while a vote can still be held without clear leadership in place, the current uncertainty about the economy is only going to get worse.
The investigation was connected to the estimated $2.5 billion price tag for renovations on the Federal Reserve's headquarters in Washington.
Well, we call him too late for a reason. We should have cut him a year ago. He's too late.
And I would remind the entire world that this is a president who was a businessman first.
Spike in energy costs. The consumer price index for March shows prices
Gas
up.
Buddy says the U.S. just saw its biggest single-day spike in gas prices in 3 years.
Says in our statute, we're not removable except for cause. We serve very long terms, seemingly endless terms.
The atrocious cost overrun of more than $1 billion.
Companies that have facilitated money laundering, Chinese-controlled companies, or financing vehicles set up by Jeffrey Epstein. It's a yes or no question.
Senator, I have worked tirelessly with the ethics officials at the Office of Government Ethics.
And you have not
come to an ethics agreement with them and have
assets.
agreed, Senator, to sell all of my financial assets,
Mr.
including
Warsh,
the Duquesne
are you refusing
assets.
to tell us?
Okay, so the Fed is currently stuck between the rock and a hard place of an incredibly difficult economic environment to navigate, and no clear leadership to actually do the navigating. Now, neither of these issues would be ideal by themselves, but they also shouldn't be considered in isolation from one another. So, beginning with the secession problem, Warsh is the current nominee to replace Powell, and as mentioned, his Senate approval has completely stalled despite not actually being a total outsider to this role. He was a Fed governor on the exact same board he is now lining himself up to lead, and he also sat on that board during the lead-up to and the recovery from the global financial crisis, so in the interest of fairness, he does have directly relevant experience. But he also comes with some fairly, notable baggage in 3 key areas. The first issue is his wealth. Warsh has an enormous personal fortune, and his wife's family has an even larger fortune with some fairly dubious connections. Now, this by itself wouldn't be disqualifying. Fed governors and chairmen typically come from an economic or banking background, and these are by their nature careers that can pay very well. Powell himself was one of the richest Fed chairmen ever. But it's the nature of Warsh's wealth that is a little bit more compromising. Because, yeah, the second issue is his prior relationships. Warsh was unable to fully deny a series of previous professional connections to the late Jeffrey Epstein in front of the Senate during his approval hearing, which, as job interviews go, is not ideal. And the third issue is his actual investment portfolio, which reportedly includes a complicated web of indirect investments into private banks. For hopefully obvious reasons, these investments are specifically forbidden for a sitting Fed chair. Any one of these alone might have been survivable in a normal political environment, but all three together, in a Senate already looking for an excuse, has been enough to keep his nomination stuck in committee with the clock ticking. But in a hilariously ironic political twist, the Republican senator currently blocking Warsh from getting out of the banking committee is not blocking him over any of that. He is blocking him because he wants the DOJ to drop their investigation into Powell, which is where this whole situation gets really, circular. The DOJ reportedly opened that investigation in the first place because the administration wanted Powell gone early, so it could install a Fed chair that would lower interest rates. So the investigation that was meant to speed up Powell's removal may now be the exact thing that delays his replacement and, perhaps more importantly, keeps the controls on the old money printer. Now, unfortunately, to actually understand how, you need to understand the bureaucracy of the Fed itself. Powell is, of course, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But to get that role, he is first also a sitting governor of its board. The chairman is appointed to 4 years at a time, and this is the role where Powell's term is about to be up. A Fed governor is appointed to 14 years, and once they are in that seat, they are extraordinarily difficult to remove by design, both to keep the Fed independent from political pressure and to stop governors from bowing to whoever happens to be in the White House in that decade. And it is actually the governorship, not the chairmanship, that carries most of the real power. Each governor gets a vote on the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the committee that actually sets interest rates. This committee is made up of 7 governors from the Fed in Washington, of which 1 is the chairman, as well as representatives from 5 out of the 12 regional Federal Reserve branches to make a total of 12 voting parties. Out of this group, the chairman is more of a first amongst equals kind of role, responsible for communicating what the Fed is doing, running the meetings, and managing the institution's public face through press conferences. But the actual decisions on rates themselves are made by a vote, between everybody on the committee, with everybody getting an equal vote. Now, this is a problem for an administration that wants to use the chairmanship as a lever to crank down rates, because even a friendly chairman can be outvoted by the other 11 people in the room, which creates an even bigger problem for the administration. Because while Powell's term as chairman is up in a week, his term as governor doesn't end until 2028. This bureaucratic detail is important because if Powell refuses to give up his seat as governor, the Fed doesn't just make another one. There are exactly 7 seats on the Board of Governors. They are set by statute. So if Warsh wants to be chairman of the Board of Governors, he needs to be a governor first. If he doesn't have a seat, he can't be the chairman, regardless of what the Senate eventually decides. Now, the only bit of good news for the administration is that one of the current governors, Stephen Miron, is technically still in his seat beyond the end of his official term, which ended back in January. So if Powell absolutely refuses to budge, Warsh could theoretically just take Miron's spot. But that also means the White House loses one of its own friendly appointees on the board who is more likely to vote on rate cuts, which sort of defeats the whole point of this exercise. What they really want is for Powell to bow out gracefully, which would then let them reappoint Miron to a brand new 14-year term and slot Warsh into Powell's old seat to get a much bigger friendly voting bloc establishment on the committee. Now, typically, this has been what has happened. Usually, if a new chairman is appointed and they are not already one of the 7 governors, the outgoing chairman will just give up their seat to make room for their replacement. The problem at the moment is that Powell wouldn't want to give up this position, because the DOJ is putting him under a criminal investigation for alleged actions he took in his position at the Fed, specifically around costly renovations to the bank's headquarters in DC. Now, it's pretty clear that this investigation is politically motivated to pressure the current chairman into lowering rates, even though, again, he does not have direct control over this. And it's also pretty clear that this investigation is unlikely to go anywhere legally. But while it's ongoing, Powell is far better protected as a member of the Fed, even if it is only so he has access to the records that could be used against him. And well, yep, lo and behold, literally as we were finalizing this video, the DOJ announced that it would be dropping the investigation, most likely to appease the Senate Banking Committee to get Warsh confirmed and in place as quickly as possible. Powell has, however, expressed his intention to remain on the board anyway, at least until the matter is fully resolved. Another potential motivating factor for his holdout is also to run interference for his colleague Lisa Cook, another Fed governor who is also under investigation, also as thinly veiled political pressure to get the board to drop interest rates or to make way for someone who will. So again, ironically, a political move that was intended to speed up Powell's departure and bring on those sweet interest rate cuts may ironically end up making both take much longer. Powell sticking around could also do more damage to this objective than just losing an extra friendly vote on the board too. It is entirely possible that if Powell stays on as just a regular governor until the end of his term in 2028, he could end up holding more actual sway over the board than whoever the official chairman ends up being. And that is assuming they get through the Senate in the first place. Powell is the person the other governors are used to working with. He knows the building, he knows the staff, he knows the data teams, and in a collegial committee, a respected ex-chair with a vote in a decade of institutional memory is not nothing. So that is the brief summation of the clusterfuck of a power struggle currently happening at the Fed. And all of this would already be very bad even if the wider economy was otherwise stable. But this is kind of like a ship going through a mutiny, right as it is sailing into a storm. So it's time to learn how money works to find out if the Fed is still going to be a stabilizing force right when we need it the most. This video is sponsored by Monarch Money. Monarch Money is a private ad-free personal finance platform that brings all your accounts into one clean dashboard. It automatically tracks your spending and net worth and helps you stay financially aligned without juggling spreadsheets. Instead of just showing where your money went, Monarch makes it easy to see the full financial picture, make smart adjustments, and make progress towards your goals with confidence. Plus, with bank-level encryption and read-only access, it is secure, and thousands of users have given it a 4.9-star rating. I started using Monarch for my monthly budget check-ins, and it has been a game-changer. All my accounts, cards, loans, and investments sync from over 13,000 institutions into one beautiful view on web or mobile, saving me time hopping between apps. I love the flexible budgeting that separates fixed and flexible spending with customizable rules and categories. And Monarch quietly combs through your numbers and surfaces patterns for you. Things like spending changes or unusual transactions explained in plain English, so you stay aware without constant alerts. There is also a built-in assistant you can ask anything about your finances, like how much you spent on travel last summer or whether you can afford a vacation without touching your savings. It answers from your actual data, not generic advice. Try Monarch yourself. Scan the QR code on screen and use code HMW50 for 50% off your first year. Okay, so assuming the secession issue actually gets sorted out within the coming weeks, it's also important to understand the economic environment that any new chairman is going to walk into. And it is, to put it generously, not ideal. The first and most immediate problem is raw political pressure. The White House very openly wants interest rates down, because lower rates normally gives the economy a short-term boost, at the long-term cost of higher inflation. Cheaper borrowing will also usually drive up asset markets, which means wealthy investors, like Warsh and a lot of the senior government officials currently pushing for rate cuts, stand to directly profit from looser monetary policy. The obvious problem, putting aside the personal profits over good governance conversation, is that asset markets are already pretty damn juiced at the moment, while at the same time, most regular people are measurably struggling with the cost of living that would only be made worse by further inflation. Asset markets are near an all-time high, while consumer sentiment is near an all-time low, which is not a great sign for statistics that in a normal economy should be highly correlated. In the past, the stock market did well when the businesses listed on that market did well, and the businesses listed on that market did well when consumers were consuming lots of stuff, and consumers only consume lots of stuff when they have confidence that they won't lose their job or be hit with rising costs in every direction. Logically, it makes sense, but according to the data, it's just not the world we live in at the moment. Which brings us to problem number 2. The data the Fed is actually looking at might not even be real. The government's statistics around inflation and employment have become increasingly questionable over the last few years. The payroll report for the last month said America added 178,000 jobs, while the labor force in the exact same report shrank by 396,000. Inflation measures have been quietly reweighted more than once, and that's not to mention the other issues that I have spent 3 out of the last 7 videos on this channel ranting about, because they seem so detached from the economy the rest of us appear to be living in, which is not a great place for a central bank to be, because the entire triple mandate of the Fed is wrapped up in these numbers. If the data is wrong, there is not much stopping the decisions from being wrong, and if the data is wrong in a way that is politically convenient, the incentive to fix it gets even weaker. None of this would be a crisis on its own, but the third problem is that there are real, identifiable supply-side forces pushing prices up, and they are almost all things the Fed has zero ability to actually fix. Tariffs have been layered into almost every major supply chain, at least in theory, even if their actual implementation remains genuinely up in the air from one week to the next. Some outside analysts have suggested that inflation could have been more or less completely solved by now if it were not for tariffs keeping import prices elevated on uncertainty. This was also a sticking point for Warsh during his Senate questioning, because he was forced to walk the line between appeasing the administration that was appointing him and the economic reality he would actually have to face once in the job. Because cutting rates into a tariff-driven inflation shock is kind of the central banker's equivalent of pouring napalm on a kitchen fire. And this is before you get to the fourth problem, which is the war in Iran. Everything downstream of oil is getting more expensive, and that is basically everything. Shipping, energy, food, fertilizer, plastic parts, even sausage raincoats are going to get more expensive. And while the market has more or less priced in a short temporary spike, a prolonged oil war would drive supply-side inflation into an already inflated economy. Now, to play devil's advocate, there is one variable that the nominated incoming Fed chair has highlighted as a reason why it would be reasonable to start cutting rates. And he kind of has a point, although perhaps not necessarily for the reasons he expects. Productivity gains from AI could, in theory, lower the cost of providing a lot of services, and pass those savings through into lower consumer prices. And this has been a popular narrative amongst groups pushing for lower rates, including Warsh himself. In practice though, at least for now, any real productivity gains from AI are currently being more than entirely offset by capex spending and energy costs going to fuel its development. And that is assuming that any downstream productivity advantages get passed along to consumers. However, that doesn't mean that this technology won't justify a rate cut, because inflation is just one of the three mandates that the Fed has to compromise between. AI is also fueling, or at the very least justifying, widespread layoffs, and layoffs reduce employment, which is another variable that the Fed is tasked with controlling. So this may be a point in favor of cutting those rates. And we know this is not speculation, because most of these companies have been more or less openly bragging about it on their quarterly earnings call as the main reason their margins are holding up. So even the one deflationary variable we have is mostly being pointed at wage suppression rather than price suppression. Which brings us to the fifth and by far the biggest problem, and it is the one nobody at the Fed really wants to say out loud. Right now, there is still a lot of faith in the US dollar as the global reserve asset, but that faith is not infinite, and there are already signs it is cracking. If the Fed cuts rates in spite of visible inflation, it risks accelerating an already existing global shift away from the US dollar as a reserve holding, and this has the potential to rapidly compound in itself. A weaker dollar means imports get more expensive, which means domestic inflation gets worse. A weaker appetite for US debt means the Treasury has to pay higher yields to find buyers, which makes borrowing more expensive for literally everyone downstream. Corporate debt is priced off treasuries. Mortgages are priced off treasuries. Car loans, student loans, small business loans, all priced off treasuries. So the scenario where the Fed cuts the short end of the curve and long-term rates go up anyway because the bond market is scared is a real thing that can actually happen. Despite no official rate changes from the Fed at all, the US government's cost of borrowing through the 10-year treasury is already up around 40 basis points since the start of the war. On a debt stack this large, 40 basis points works out to tens of billions of dollars in additional interest payments, which is real money even by federal budget standards. And that is the market repricing US debt before the Fed has even moved. So if investors lose faith in this institution, rate cuts could ironically send long-term rates even higher, as bond buyers demand a bigger risk premium for holding our money. Now, none of these problems are unfixable, but they are going to require diligent, sensible, long-term planning as well as potentially unpopular decisions from the Fed. At the best of times, these are a long list of problems impacting everything everywhere all at once. But right now, we are not even entirely sure who is going to be running the institution in 2 weeks' time, or what their real objectives are going to be. Oh yeah, and that's also not to mention the debt problem. Go and watch this video next to find out how we have avoided this $40 trillion liability from turning into a crisis. For now. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.